There's also another way to think about the Kamasutra, and that's like having a structure that's similar to most Sanskrit drama. So having just the chapters laid out doesn't really make it jump off the page. So Wendy Doniger, who is a scholar at UChicago who focuses on sexuality within Hindu traditions, says, she sort of summarizes it this way. In Act 1, which literally sets the stage for the drama, the bachelor sets up his pad. In Act 2, he perfects his sexual technique. Then he seduces a virgin, Act 3, gets married and lives with a wife or wives, Act 4. Tiring of her or them, he seduces other men's wives, Act 5. Finally, when he is too old to manage it at all, he resorts to the ancient Indian equivalent of Viagra, aphrodisiacs, and magic spells. So, in a way, it sort of covers the entire life of a person who's interested in pursuing Kama as one of the human ends. So moving from the structure, what is the Kamasutra for? First of all, does anyone know what Kama and Sutra mean? Do you know, sir? In the purple shirt? Who have never met before?
Is pleasure, sometimes translated, but I think that it's sometimes used as passion as well.
Yeah.
Sutra is a short text. It literally means something like pulled together, to like suture together.
Exactly. Yep. There's a cognate in English with suture. So Kama, as this gentleman whose name I guess was Aaron suggested, Kama can mean pleasure, sensual pleasure, passion, the erotic in general. There's also a deity named Kama, who I think we'll see in the next slide, who he's basically maybe yes, you could argue that he's a South Asian equivalent of Cupid, who he goes around and he has a bow and arrow, but instead of shooting arrows, he shoots flowers at lovers and causes them to fall in love. And so the fact that this is the Kamasutra is, you could translate it as the foundational text on sensual pleasure or erotics. So Kama falls into a category that's critically important for what you could say Hindu traditions in South Asia, which is that it's one of the 3, maybe 4, purusharthas, or the aims of life. And the 3 are dharma, artha, and kama. Dharma, which can be often translated as virtue or proper etiquette, or as most people do, they just don't translate it at all because it's very hard to capture the entire semantic range, is the first one. It's sort of within the realm of the religious. Artha, which can mean wealth, goal, meaning, purpose, falls into the realm of everyday affairs. So if part of your responsibility is to be pious as a human being, another is to be pious and also follow the rules that are dictated to your caste. Artha means you're supposed to try to make money, and also start a family and whatnot. It's all within that sphere. You can think of them as spheres of activity. And then kama is to cultivate sensual pleasure, but to do so that you do not interfere with either artha or dharma. The Kamasutra says, undertake any project that might achieve the 3 aims of life, or 2, or even just 1, but not one that achieves one at the cost of the other 2. So we're thinking Kamasutra, what it wants to do, teach you how to have sensual pleasure, to be erotic, but to do so properly, according to these constraints. Going back to the idea of, to the erotic esoterica, and the question of like whether people actually took all these spices, rubbed them on their junk, and then said, look, now you're in love with me. What you can say is that the Kamasutra is a combination of descriptive, prescriptive, and imaginative. That is, it is both an is and a could be text. It is a work that proposes to tell us how things are, for example, or how things are, and also about how things could be. It is a text that seems to not be only about actual life, but also an imagined life in art. The text could have been used and was used by poets as a source book for erotica. So, in the plays that you read from this time period and from beyond, a lot of the sort of erotic conventions were sourced from the Kamasutra. And so it's both, it's a sort of a handbook for everyday life, but then it also has elements that are part of an ideal, sort of aestheticized, sensual encounter. Going down to the next bullet point. So we have gone through Kamasutra, we know it's a foundational text. We know it's trying to teach us to have sensual pleasure in this properly constrained way. One other thing that it's trying to do, I would say, is rescuing the erotic. And rescuing it from what? Well, probably from unrestrained, raw sexuality. There's this idea that there's a difference between sexuality, or just like raw sexual passion, and the erotic. And that difference is restraint, and knowing when to hold back and when to let go. The Kamasutra, you could say, its most valuable insight is that pleasure needs to be cultivated. That in the realm of sex, nature requires culture. So there's that going on. And then there's also this establishment of women as full participants in sexual life, as opposed to simple, passive recipients of male sexual aggression. And so when you look back at previous texts that often dictate the behavior of men and women in a sexual context, it's often women are just kind of told to do nothing except things. Whereas here, in order for the erotic to truly be performed, men and women have to play active roles, which I believe in. I think that's cool. So here's Kama. He's riding a little parrot, and he has his flower arrow over there, and he goes around. He's like alive, but he's also kind of dead, because there's a famous myth that Shiva, who's very pissed at Kama, burns him to ash with his third eye. And so Kama's also thought of as a pile of ash sometimes. So who is the Kamasutra? Yeah. So we looked at what the Kamasutra is saying, like what it's setting out to do. Who is it setting out for? So besides us, of course, like Harvard students and whatnot reading this text, the Kamasutra says that it's for 3 groups of people. The man about town is sort of a maybe a dandy figure, like a figure who has a significant amount of wealth, has very few social ties, and hangs out at the king's court. Basically spending his time flirting with people, flirting with women, as well as cultivating skills in the 64 arts. There are only 64 arts, and they range from normal things such as painting, singing, to teaching parrots and mynah birds how to speak, to speaking in riddles, to dressing up in crazy disguises. So very wide definition of what art is, or what arts could be. In addition to the man about town, the text also says it's for the courtesan deluxe, who is a person who would hang out at the king's court and have a significant amount of power, in the sense of having the freedom to sort of do whatever she wanted to. Where she could hang out at the court, she could learn written languages, for example, learn Sanskrit. She would have a significant background in many of the arts, and she would hang out and often had a significant amount of agency over men, as we learn in the courtesan chapter. And then also for the daughters of kings, or for the Mahamatra Dupita, who were expected to be familiar with all of the aspects of the Kamasutra. So you could sort of think of the Kamasutra not as just teaching sexual procedures for acquiring sexual pleasure, but in a way it's trying to, as I said, portray an entire sphere of life. So thinking about that, who cares? Why bother? That is, why should we, people who are living in 2016 in the United States, read a text that was written in the 3rd century across the world and in a radically different cultural context? Like, in a way, you could expand this to ask, why engage with human documents at all? I sort of give 2 reasons. The first is informational. That is, by reading texts, by engaging with art and what's not, we expose ourselves to different attitudes and patterns of thought. And in addition to that, there's also a transformational reason, where I believe that reading a text like the Kamasutra with a certain amount, if you call it hermeneutics of respect, that is, reading it with an open mind and the willingness to be changed, can serve as a vehicle for self-transformation. Which kind of makes sense, because like we read texts, and why do we read texts? Why do we engage with art? Well, maybe to come out changed in some way, to be moved, to learn something new, to have our categories changed or challenged. And in the case of the Kamasutra, also to maybe add a couple new tricks to our sex game. So with this twofold reason in mind, we can go forward and maybe look at some of the conceptual categories that are going on and are used in the Kamasutra. So the question is, what is sex? But a more accurate question is, what isn't sex in the Kamasutra? I have here a nice little image from the Kamasutra, which is an app, which I don't think this is an actual, or like, I don't think this is mentioned as a position, but it's worth our while, we're at least told. So now we're talking about chapter 2, and the contents of chapter 2, where we have this series of typologies or taxonomies, which is a sort of a distinctive feature of many Sanskrit-based knowledge systems, where a way of sort of creating a science, the idea was that a science would be able to describe everything that you would encounter and more in the real world. And so we have all of these typologies. For example, first off, we have typologies based on size of the sexual organ. So a quote we have is, the very first verse is, "A man is called a hare, a bull, or a stallion, according to the size of his sexual organ. A woman, however, is called a doe, a mare, or an elephant cow." And so we have three types of men, 3 types of women. Then we proceed to, the text then gives us sort of a combinatorial breakdown. So there are 3 equal couplings between sexual partners of similar size, and 6 unequal ones between sexual partners of dissimilar size. So this text is very interested in going through all of the options. It's saying, okay, there's 3 and 3, and then there's 3 that work, and 3 that kind of lead to problems, and then it proceeds to give a breakdown of what happens when you have different people of different sizes matching up. Another type, so we have typologies of the size, endurance, and temperament of lovers, or people who are performing sex, these sex. We also have taxonomies of types of sexual intercourse, oral sex, slapping, biting, and scratching. For example, and the sort of structure is that the sub-chapter will start out by listing all of the types and then proceed to give descriptions of them all. And so we have, in the oral sex chapter, oral sex involves 8 acts, one after the other. You have the casual, the biting the sides, the outer tongues, the inner tongues, kissing, polishing, sucking the mango, and swallowing. And then it proceeds to give an account of what all of these different procedures are.